There is a habit so quiet, so socially acceptable, that most people never even realize how much of their life it controls. On Stoicism Breath, this is where we begin. It shows up in the smallest moments. You say no, but then you soften it. You feel something clearly, but rush to explain why you feel it. You make a choice that is right for you, but immediately start building a case for it, as if your decision is not complete until someone else approves of it. From the outside, it looks polite, mature, considerate. But if you look closer, something deeper is happening. It is not really communication. It is permission. And that changes everything. Because the more you explain yourself as if your truth needs to be accepted before it can be valid, the less free you feel to simply exist as you are. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology gave it new language. The moment your peace depends on being understood by everyone around you, that peace is no longer yours. It belongs to their reactions, their interpretations, their mood, their willingness to agree. And that is a fragile place to build a life. No explanation can guarantee acceptance. No perfect wording can protect you from judgment. No amount of clarity can make every person see you correctly. And yet people spend years trying. They keep adjusting their tone, reshaping their truth, editing what they really mean so it lands more softly, sounds more reasonable, feels easier to approve of. They hope that if they explain it just right, they will finally be seen the way they want to be seen. But what if that is not where freedom begins? What if the real shift is not in finally being understood, but in no longer needing that understanding in order to stand in your own life? Because once that idea truly sinks in, something begins to change. Quietly, you stop negotiating your place in the world, and you start standing in it. Think about the last time you said no. Not just the word itself, but everything that came after it. The extra sentence, the justification, the softening, the part where you tried to make your refusal easier for the other person to digest. It almost happens automatically, doesn't it? As if no by itself is too sharp, too incomplete, too exposed. So instead of simply declining, most people explain. They don't even always realize they are doing it. But that urge does not come from nowhere. And it is rarely about clarity. It is about permission. Somewhere along the way, the simple act of choosing for yourself stopped feeling sufficient. It started to feel like something that needed to be approved, validated, or at the very least understood by someone else before you could fully trust it. And when that shift happens, it does not arrive in a dramatic way. There is no big warning sign. It is subtle, quiet, almost invisible. But from that moment on, the way you move through life begins to change. You stop acting from certainty, and you start acting from anticipation. You think ahead before you speak. You try to predict reactions before they happen. You rehearse your words in your mind, adjusting them until they sound reasonable enough, gentle enough, safe enough. Suddenly, it is no longer just about what you want, what you believe, or what feels true to you. It becomes about how your truth will be received once it leaves your mouth. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not physically, mentally. Because now every decision carries an invisible second weight. Not just the decision itself, but the explanation that must follow it. At some point, being misunderstood stops feeling like a small inconvenience and starts feeling emotionally dangerous. not in the obvious sense, not in a life or death sense, but in that quieter way that lingers. The kind of discomfort that stays in your chest long after the conversation ends. The kind that teaches you, without ever saying it directly, that misunderstanding must be avoided. So you adapt. You explain more clearly, more carefully, more thoroughly. And slowly, without noticing it, you become someone who translates their inner world into whatever version seems easiest for others to accept. You become easier to receive, more agreeable, more digestible, less likely to create friction. But in the process, something important begins to disappear. Because every time you reshape your truth just to make it easier for others to hold, you move a little further away from yourself. And if you do that often enough, you begin to forget what it feels like to trust your own experience without needing someone else to confirm that it makes sense. That is the real cost. You stop asking, "Is this true for me?" and start asking, "Will this make sense to them?" You stop measuring from the inside and start measuring from the outside. You begin to rely on the response of other people to tell you whether what you feel is reasonable, whether your boundary is fair, whether your choice is valid. And when that happens, your internal authority does not disappear all at once. It weakens slowly, in tiny ways. In the extra sentence after your no. In the apology before your boundary. In the explanation attached to a decision that needed none. That is where the deeper tension begins. Because now you are no longer simply living. You are negotiating. Not with the world, exactly. With yourself. Every feeling must be translated. Every thought must be filtered. Every decision must be rehearsed before it is expressed. Even when nothing dramatic is happening, your mind stays busy adjusting, refining, preparing. It becomes a constant internal editing process. And what makes it so hard to recognize is that from the outside, it can look like self-awareness. It can look like emotional intelligence. It can look like kindness. But inside, it often feels like strain. Because your life is no longer moving from the center outward. It is moving from the outside inward. You are no longer asking, "What is right?" You are asking, "What will be accepted?" And the Stoics would say that this is exactly where suffering begins, the moment you place too much value on something outside your control, especially the opinions, perceptions, and understanding of other people. Once your peace is tied to whether someone else agrees with your explanation, you have handed your stability to something you can never fully manage. That is why this pattern is so draining. No matter how precise your words are, someone can still misunderstand you. No matter how thoughtful your reasoning is, someone can still judge you. No matter how carefully you explain your heart, someone can still reject it. So if your peace depends on preventing that, your peace will always remain unstable. And instability changes the way you live. You begin to react instead of act. You adjust instead of decide. You become shaped less by what you believe is right, and more by what you think will be accepted. That is the hidden emotional cost of over-explaining yourself. It is not just a communication habit. It is a slow transfer of authority, a quiet surrender of inner certainty, a pattern that teaches you to seek permission where you should be standing in self-trust. But the moment you begin to see it clearly, another possibility opens. What if your no does not need a speech after it? What if your emotion does not need a defense? What if your choice does not need to be translated into something more comfortable for everyone else before it can be real? That is where the return begins. Not in becoming cold, not in becoming careless, but in remembering that your inner world was never meant to be negotiated into acceptability before it could belong to you. And once you begin to reclaim that, even in small ways, something in you starts to come back online. A steadiness, a dignity, a kind of internal ground. Not because the world suddenly becomes more understanding, but because you stop making your self-trust depend on whether it does. There's a point where you begin to notice something most people ignore. On Stoicism Breath, this is where the real shit begins. Every thought you have starts going through a filter. Every emotion gets edited before it's expressed. Every decision is rehearsed in your mind before it ever reaches the outside world. And at first, it doesn't seem like a problem. It feels responsible, thoughtful, even wise. But over time, it becomes exhausting. Not the kind of exhaustion you can explain easily, but the kind that never truly turns off. Even in quiet moments, your mind keeps working, adjusting, refining, preparing for conversations that haven't even happened yet. It's like carrying an invisible weight that no one else can see, but you feel it constantly. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology gave it a name. They saw that much of our discomfort doesn't come from what actually happens, but from how much importance we place on things we can't control, especially how other people see us. And think about it for a second. When you constantly feel the need to explain yourself, what are you really doing? You're placing your sense of rightness in someone else's understanding. You're waiting for their agreement to feel valid. You're handing over your internal stability to something completely outside your control. Because no matter how clearly you speak, no matter how carefully you choose your words, no matter how pure your intention is, you still cannot control how someone interprets you. You can be honest and still be misunderstood. You can be clear and still be judged. You can be sincere and still be rejected. And if your peace depends on avoiding that, then your peace will always feel fragile. That's when life starts to shift in a subtle but powerful way. You stop acting and start reacting. You stop deciding and start adjusting. And slowly, your life is no longer shaped by what you believe is right, but by what you think will be accepted. But here's where everything begins to change. The moment you step out of that pattern, even slightly. At first, it feels uncomfortable, almost wrong. You say less. You pause before explaining. You resist the urge to justify every decision. And for the first time, you let your choices stand on their own. And in that space, something unfamiliar appears. Silence. Not just around you, but within you. That constant mental noise, the overthinking, the rehearsing, the need to prepare for every possible reaction, it begins to fade. Maybe not completely, but enough for you to notice. And strangely, that silence can feel uncomfortable at first. Because without explanations, there's nothing protecting you. No cushion, no defense, no extra layer to soften how you're perceived. You're just there, standing in your choices. And that requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority. The Stoics believe that a person should be rooted in their own judgment, guided by reason, aligned with their values, not shaped by approval, not pulled by reaction. And here's the truth most people never hear. Real stability doesn't come from explaining yourself better. It comes from needing to explain yourself less. It comes from trusting that your decisions are valid, even when they are misunderstood. And as that trust begins to grow, something subtle but powerful starts to happen. Your relationships begin to shift. Not because you forced anything, but because your presence is different. You're no longer trying to convince. You're no longer trying to please. You're no longer adjusting yourself to fit expectations. And people feel that. Some will react immediately. They may question you more, push you, try to pull you back into the version of you they were used to, the one who explained everything, softened everything, made everything easier for them to process. But others, they'll respond differently. They'll notice something in you. A kind of calm. A kind of clarity. A kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. Because there is something undeniably powerful about someone who no longer feels the need to defend their existence. And that's where a deeper realization begins to settle in. Respect is not something you earn by explaining yourself better. It's something people feel when you are aligned with yourself. When your words are not trying to prove something. When your actions are not asking for permission. When your presence is not negotiating its place. Eventually, you reach a point where the need to explain simply fades. Not because you're trying to prove strength, but because there's nothing left to prove. You trust your decisions. You accept your emotions. You allow yourself to exist without constantly seeking validation. And when that happens, something changes. Not just in how you see yourself, but in how the world begins to respond to you. There comes a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when something inside you begins to shift. On Stoicism Breath, this is where real transformation starts to take root. You stop asking to be understood. You stop reshaping your truth just to fit someone else's expectations. And instead, you simply exist, present, grounded, steady in a way that doesn't need to be explained. And here's the paradox most people never expect. The moment you stop trying so hard to be understood, people begin to understand you more clearly. Why? Because your words are no longer carrying the weight of justification. They're no longer filtered, softened, or adjusted to gain approval. They become a direct extension of who you are, simple, honest, and real. But if this idea resonates with you, don't rush past it. Sit with it. Because this shift, from constant explanation to internal authority, is not something you learn once and master forever. It's something you return to, again and again, in small daily moments. Every time you choose clarity over approval, alignment over explanation, truth over acceptance. You strengthen that foundation within yourself. And if you think about it, this pattern didn't start overnight. It often begins early, in moments that seem small at first. A time when you expressed something honestly and were met with confusion. A moment when your feelings were dismissed or corrected. A situation where your words didn't land the way you expected, and instead of understanding, you felt a subtle sense of rejection. And in those moments, something quiet begins to form. A thought. A conclusion. Maybe the way I am isn't enough. So you start to adjust. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin translating your thoughts into something more acceptable. You soften your opinions. You reshape your emotions. You explain more, so things feel smoother, safer, easier for others to accept. And at first, it works. Conversations feel lighter. Conflicts are avoided. You feel like you have more control over how people see you. But over time, that control comes at a cost. Because the more you rely on explanation to make yourself acceptable, the less you trust your own experience as it is. You start second-guessing your instincts. You hesitate before speaking honestly. You check yourself, adjust yourself, filter yourself, just to make sure you won't be misunderstood. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to depend on that process. You start looking outward for confirmation. You read people's reactions, their tone, their expressions. Every subtle signal becomes a guide for how you should feel and how you should behave. And at some point, those signals begin to matter more than your own inner truth. You don't adjust because you want to. You adjust because it feels necessary. Because it feels safer. More stable. Less likely to create discomfort. But here's the deeper insight most people overlook. We are often more afraid than we are actually hurt. And we suffer more from imagination than from reality. The fear of being misunderstood can feel overwhelming, even when nothing has actually gone wrong. So your mind tries to protect you. It pushes you to explain more, clarify more, fix things before they even become a problem. But in doing so, it keeps the pattern alive. Because explanation becomes your way of managing fear, even if it never truly resolves it. And the longer this continues, the more subtle the damage becomes. You begin to forget what it feels like to trust your own experience, without translating it, without reshaping it, without needing someone else to validate it. You forget what it feels like to simply be as you are. And that's where the real shift begins. Not when the world changes, but when you finally start coming back to yourself. There's a subtle shift that happens so quietly, most people never notice it. On Stoicism Breath, this is where awareness begins to deepen. That original sense of clarity, the one where you simply knew what felt right, starts to fade. And in its place, something else takes over. You become more careful, more calculated, more controlled. At first, it feels like growth. You think before you speak. You choose your words wisely. You avoid unnecessary conflict. But look closer. What feels like safety is slowly creating distance. Distance from your own voice. Distance from your natural expression. Distance from who you really are. Because now, instead of speaking from clarity, you're speaking from caution. And over time, this doesn't just happen occasionally. It becomes your default. You don't just explain yourself in difficult moments. You explain yourself in almost every moment. It becomes automatic. A reflex. And when something becomes that automatic, it starts to feel like identity. You begin to believe, this is just who I am. But underneath that belief, there's a quiet question waiting. Not loud, not urgent, but powerful enough to change everything if you actually face it. What if the very thing that makes you feel safe is also the thing disconnecting you from yourself? Think about that. Because this is where life starts to shift in a way that's almost invisible from the outside. You're still functioning, still communicating, still showing up. But internally, something is different. You're no longer just living. You are negotiating, not with the world, but with yourself. Every thought is filtered before it's spoken. Every emotion is adjusted before it's shown. Every decision is rehearsed before it's made. And eventually, this becomes your normal. Not because you chose it consciously, but because it feels like the safest way to move through life. And here's the tricky part. At first, it actually feels like a strength. You become someone who is thoughtful, careful, emotionally aware. You can read situations. You understand people. You anticipate reactions before they happen. From the outside, it looks like emotional intelligence. But inside, something else is happening. Because what starts as awareness slowly turns into dependence. You're no longer just aware of how others might respond. You start relying on that awareness to guide your actions. And that's where the exhaustion begins. Not because thinking is tiring, but because you're no longer just thinking about what's true for you. You're thinking about how your truth will be received. You're carrying your perspective and the imagined perspectives of everyone around you. And that weight doesn't go away. It follows you into conversations, into decisions, even into moments when you're completely alone. Because the negotiation never really stops. Even after the interaction ends, your mind keeps replaying, adjusting, refining, rewriting what you said or what you should have said. This is the hidden cost of managing perception. Your life slowly shifts from living freely to presenting yourself in a way that minimizes risk. And the strange part is, the risk is rarely clear. It's not always about something specific. It's more like a quiet, constant unease. A feeling that you might be misunderstood, judged, rejected. So you try to stay ahead of it. You explain more, clarify more, justify more. You make sure your intentions are visible. Your reasoning is clear. Your actions are acceptable. But in doing all of that, something important begins to fade. Your connection to your own internal authority. That quiet voice inside you that says, "This is right, because it aligns with who I am." Because now, your sense of right and wrong is no longer grounded within you. It's shaped by how others respond. And once that happens, you don't just lose clarity. You lose yourself, little by little, without even realizing it. There's a moment, so subtle you might miss it, when your life starts being measured not by what feels right to you, but by how it is received by others. On Stoicism Breath, this is where awareness becomes uncomfortable, but necessary. You begin to evaluate your choices differently. Not by truth, but by acceptance. You ask yourself, will this be understood? Will this be approved? Will this create resistance? And slowly, without realizing it, your decisions stop being guided by your values and start being shaped by reactions. The Stoics saw this clearly. They taught something simple but powerful. There are things within your control and things outside of it. Your actions, your intentions, your values. Those belong to you. But how people interpret you, how they react, how they judge, that has never been yours to control. And yet, when you constantly feel the need to explain yourself, something dangerous happens. You blur that line. You begin treating other people's understanding as something you can manage, something you should manage. But think about that for a moment. How much energy does it take to control something that was never yours to begin with? That's where the instability begins. Because now, your sense of peace depends on something uncertain, something constantly shifting, something you can never fully secure. And this is where a deeper truth starts to reveal itself. It's not the misunderstanding that hurts you the most. It's what you believe that misunderstanding means. You don't just think, "They didn't understand me." You feel, "They don't approve. They're rejecting me. Maybe something is wrong with me." And because of that feeling, you try to prevent it. You explain more. You justify more. You adjust more. Not because the situation truly requires it, but because the emotion behind it is pushing you to act. And here's the problem most people never see. No matter how much you explain, you still cannot control how you are perceived. Someone can still misunderstand you. Someone can still judge you. Someone can still disagree. And when that happens, Everything you built, every explanation, every adjustment, suddenly feels fragile, like it could collapse at any moment. And instead of feeling safer, you feel more anxious. Because now you think, maybe I didn't explain enough. Maybe I need to clarify more. Maybe I should go back and fix it. And just like that, the cycle continues. You explain to avoid discomfort, but explaining reinforces the belief that discomfort must be avoided. And over time, that belief becomes stronger than your own sense of truth. You start trusting the process of explanation more than your own judgment. You rely on it to feel secure, even though that security never really lasts. And somewhere in all of this, a quiet question begins to appear. Not loud, not urgent, but persistent enough to change everything if you actually listen to it. What happens if you stop negotiating with yourself? What happens if you let a decision exist without explaining it? Not as rebellion, not as defiance, but as trust. Trust in your own perspective. Trust in your own reasoning. Trust in your own sense of what is right for you. Because here's the truth. The more you depend on others to validate your choices, the less stable those choices will feel. But the more you learn to stand in your decisions without needing them to be accepted, the more grounded you become. Not because people suddenly agree with you, but because your certainty no longer depends on that agreement. And this shift, it doesn't happen overnight. It begins in small, almost invisible moments. The moment you choose not to explain something that doesn't need explaining. The moment you allow a misunderstanding to exist without rushing to correct it. The moment you realize your internal authority is not something you need to negotiate every time you interact with the world. But as this shift begins, something else appears. Anxiety. Not all at once, but gradually. It builds layer by layer. First, a small hesitation. Then, overthinking. Then, the urge to go back, adjust, clarify, explain again. Even when nothing has actually gone wrong. And that's when you begin to see it clearly. This isn't just a habit. It's a pattern. And the moment you recognize it is the moment you finally have the power to break it. There's something almost invisible happening in your mind, and once you see it clearly, it changes everything. On Stoicism Breath, this is where awareness becomes power. Even when nothing has gone wrong. Even when no one has said anything negative. That urge is still there. Quiet, persistent, pushing you to explain just a little more. To clarify something that didn't need clarification. To fix something that was never actually broken. And if you're honest, you've felt this before. You replay a conversation in your head. You think, maybe I should have said it differently. Maybe I should explain it again, just to be safe. But here's the deeper truth. It's not about what happened. It's about what might happen. As Seneca once said, we often suffer more in imagination than in reality. And that imagined discomfort, that fear of being misunderstood, that anticipation of judgment, it's enough to keep the entire cycle running. Because once your mind gets used to anticipating misunderstanding, it starts treating it like a threat, something that must be prevented at all costs. So you step in early. You explain your tone before anyone questions it. You clarify your intentions before they're misunderstood. You justify your reasoning before it's challenged. And in that moment, it feels like control. Like you've reduced the risk. Like you've protected yourself. But that feeling doesn't last. Because the next moment comes. The next interaction. The next possibility of being misunderstood. And the cycle starts again. This is where overthinking stops being just a habit and becomes a pattern. A loop that feeds itself. The more you explain, the more you feel the need to explain again. Because every explanation reinforces the same belief. If I don't explain, something might go wrong. If I don't clarify, I might be seen the wrong way. And over time, that belief becomes automatic. Your mind doesn't turn off. Even in silence, it keeps running, replaying past conversations, adjusting what you said, preparing for what you might say next time. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people try to avoid. No matter how clearly you explain yourself, you still cannot control how you are perceived. You can be precise. You can be honest. You can be intentional. And still, someone might misunderstand you. Someone might judge you. Someone might disagree. And if your sense of security depends on preventing that, you will never feel secure. Because you are trying to control something that was never yours. The Stoics understood this deeply. They said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." And the moment your focus shifts away from your own actions and toward how others interpret them, you give that power away. Not all at once, but gradually. You stop choosing and start reacting. You stop deciding and start adjusting. And without even noticing it, your behavior becomes shaped by something external instead of something internal. This is where the shift becomes clear. You're no longer acting based on what you believe is right. You're acting based on what you think will be accepted. And those two things, they are not the same. One is grounded. The other is conditional. One comes from within. The other depends on what happens outside of you. And the more you rely on acceptance as your guide, the further you drift from your own direction. At first, it's subtle. Small adjustments. Choosing your words more carefully. explaining a little more than necessary. Nothing extreme. Nothing obvious. But over time, those small adjustments begin to stack. They form a pattern. A pattern where your actions are no longer fully yours. They are shaped by anticipation, by imagined reactions, by the quiet desire to avoid discomfort. And that's how it happens. Not all at once, but slowly, silently. You stop living from who you are and start living from who you think you need to be. There comes a point where something shifts so deeply, you don't even notice when it began. On Stoicism Breath, this is where patterns stop being behaviors and start becoming identity. At first, you explain yourself only in certain situations. A difficult conversation, a moment of tension, a fear of being misunderstood. But over time, something changes. It becomes automatic. You start filtering yourself without thinking. You explain things before anyone even asks. You soften your boundaries before they're ever challenged. And because it happens so naturally, it feels normal. It feels like, this is just how life works. This is just who I am. But beneath that sense of normal, there's something else. A quiet tension. A subtle pressure that never fully goes away. Because no matter how much you try to manage how others see you, you can never fully succeed. There will always be uncertainty. Always the possibility that someone misunderstands you. Always the chance that someone sees things differently. And that means the effort never ends. You keep explaining, keep adjusting, keep refining. But it never feels complete. It never feels enough. And this is where the Stoics offer something radically different. As Marcus Aurelius reminded us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. But the more you try to control how others perceive you, the further you move away from that power. And eventually, a realization begins to form. Not all at once. Not like a sudden breakthrough. But slowly, quietly, you start to see something clearly. This is not a game you can win. No matter how much you explain. No matter how careful you are. No matter how precise your words become. There will always be something outside your control. And when that truth finally settles in, the question changes. It's no longer, how can I explain myself better? It becomes, what would it look like to stop trying to control what cannot be controlled? What if your decisions didn't need to be explained first? What if your actions could stand on their own? What if your truth didn't require approval to exist? Because the moment you stop playing that game, something shifts. Not immediately in how others see you, but deeply in how you experience yourself. The tension begins to loosen. That constant need to adjust starts to fade. And in its place, something new appears. Not loud confidence, not perfect certainty, but something quieter, more stable. A kind of inner grounding that doesn't depend on being understood. And this feeling, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's built over time. From years of believing your choices needed explanation, that your feelings needed justification, that your truth needed validation. So when you begin to step away from that pattern, even slightly, your mind reacts. It tells you, say more, explain this, clarify just in case. Not because the moment requires it, but because you've been conditioned to fill that space. And if you pause, just for a second, if you resist that urge, even slightly, something unexpected begins to emerge. Silence. Not just silence in conversation, but silence inside you. The absence of that constant pressure to explain, justify, adjust. And at first, it doesn't feel peaceful. It feels exposed. Because without explanation, there's nothing protecting you. No buffer. No cushion. No defense. Your decisions simply exist as they are. And that's where the real transformation begins. Because standing in your choices, without explaining them, requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority. The kind that doesn't come from being understood, but from being aligned with yourself. And for most people, that kind of authority feels unfamiliar. Not because they don't have it, but because they've spent so much time looking outward for validation, that they've lost connection with what was always within. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed a person should be rooted in their own judgment, guided by reason, aligned with their values, not shaped by approval, not dependent on agreement, not controlled by external reactions. And the moment you begin to stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you begin moving in that direction. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. And in that quiet shift, a simple truth becomes clear. Stop wasting time trying to explain who you should be, and start becoming who you already are. There is a moment in life when everything simplifies, not because the world becomes easier, but because you finally stop complicating it. On Stoicism Breath, this is where real alignment begins. B1. It sounds simple, almost too simple. But hidden inside that idea is something most people overlook. Your actions do not need constant explanation to be valid. Your identity is not built on how well you justify yourself. It is built on how consistently you live in alignment with what you know is right. Think about that for a second. How much of your energy has gone into explaining, proving, clarifying? And what if none of that was ever required? Because the more you rely on explanation to define who you are, the further you move away from something much simpler and much stronger: clarity. And as you begin to let your decisions stand on their own, something starts to shift inside you. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. That constant noise in your mind begins to fade. The urge to replay conversations, to edit your words, to think of what you should have said. It starts to lose its grip. Why? Because you're no longer trying to perfect how you're perceived. You're simply acting, and letting that be enough. Now, this doesn't mean you stop communicating. It doesn't mean you become distant or indifferent. It means something far more powerful. Your communication becomes intentional. You speak when it matters, not when you feel the need to justify your existence. You explain when clarity is needed, not when you're chasing acceptance. And that one distinction changes everything. Because now your words come from choice, not fear. From alignment, not anxiety. And with that shift, a different kind of stability begins to form. Not loud, not attention-seeking, but steady, reliable, unshaken. It doesn't depend on how others respond. It doesn't require constant validation. It simply exists. And the more you rely on that internal stability, the less you need anything external to confirm it. Of course, this doesn't mean the discomfort disappears overnight. There will still be moments. Moments where the urge to explain comes rushing back. Moments where silence feels uncomfortable. Moments where saying less feels risky. But here's the difference. Those moments are no longer weaknesses. They become opportunities. Opportunities to pause. To notice the impulse. To understand it without automatically obeying it. Because this isn't about becoming silent. It's about becoming intentional. It's about learning to stand in your decisions without constantly supporting them with explanation. To trust that what you choose is valid, not because others understand it, but because it aligns with your judgment. And that kind of trust, it doesn't come from saying more. It comes from needing to say less. Over time, something even deeper happens. You stop trying. Not in a careless way, but in a grounded, natural way. You don't have to remind yourself to explain less. It just happens. Because there's less to prove, less to defend, less to justify. And in that space, a powerful realization begins to settle in. The stability you were searching for in other people's understanding was always available within you. You just kept looking for it in places where it could never fully exist. And when that realization takes hold, something shifts, not just inside you, but around you. Your relationships begin to change. Not because you forced boundaries, not because you made dramatic declarations, but because your presence is different. You're no longer trying to function at all times. You're no longer taking your words to feel approval. And people feel it, even if it can't explain it. At first, it's subtle. You say a little less. You explain a little less. You pause before adding that extra justification. And sometimes, you don't add it at all. And in that silence, something changes. The dynamic shifts. People who are used to the old version of you, the one who explained, softened, adjusted, begin to notice the difference. There's less for them to analyze, less for them to question, less for them to reshape. And while some may resist that change, others will recognize it immediately. Not as distance, not as coldness, but as clarity, as calmness, as a quiet, grounded strength that doesn't need to announce itself. And that is where true respect begins. There comes a point in this journey where something shifts so quietly, you almost miss it. On Stoicism Breath, this is where everything starts to feel lighter, not because life has fewer challenges, but because you're no longer carrying what was never yours to begin with. When you stop feeling the need to constantly justify yourself, something else happens at the same time. You stop accepting situations where explanation is expected, just to be accepted. Think about that. How many times have you explained yourself, not because it was necessary, but because it felt required? And what if that requirement was never real? Because over time, as you begin to step away from that pattern, it becomes natural. You don't have to remind yourself anymore. You don't have to think, say less, explain less. It just happens. Not because you're holding back, but because there's simply less to prove, less to manage, less to defend. And in that space, something powerful becomes clear. The way people respond to you often reflects how you relate to yourself. If you treat your own choices like they need constant validation, others will do the same. But when you start treating your decisions as valid, without explanation, that pattern shifts. And with it, everything around you begins to change. Your conversations feel different. Your relationships feel different. Even your presence feels different. And then, one day, without warning, you notice something subtle. The urge to explain is still there, but it's weaker. It doesn't control you anymore. You feel it rise. You pause. And then you let it pass. And in that small moment, a deeper truth reveals itself. There's nothing left to prove. Not because the world has suddenly become more understanding. It hasn't. People still misunderstand. They still judge. They still disagree. But something inside you has changed. You no longer see those moments as threats. You no longer feel the need to fix them, manage them, control them. You begin to see them for what they are: a natural part of human interaction. And because of that, the constant need to adjust, to clarify, to justify begins to dissolve. Not by force, but on its own. You start trusting your decisions more. Not because you're always certain, but because you no longer need certainty to move forward. You understand something most people overlook. Doubt can exist without invalidating your choices. You can feel uncertain and still act. You can feel misunderstood and still stand firm. You allow yourself to feel what you feel without reshaping it into something more acceptable. And that changes everything, because that acceptance creates a kind of internal stability that doesn't depend on anyone else. It's not loud. It doesn't demand attention. But it's steady, reliable, unshakable in a quiet way. And from that steadiness, something else begins to shift. Your inner world becomes simpler. There's less noise, less second-guessing, less replaying conversations in your head, trying to fix what's already passed. You speak, you act, and then you move forward. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer feel responsible for controlling every outcome. And in that, a new kind of presence emerges. You become more grounded, more focused, more here. And interestingly, as you change internally, the world around you begins to respond differently too. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. People start to notice something. There's clarity in how you speak, even when you say less. There's consistency in how you act, even when they don't fully understand you. And that consistency builds something powerful: trust. Not the kind built on explanation, but the kind built on alignment. You're no longer asking to be understood. That question loses its weight. You express yourself when it matters, but you don't depend on the response to validate it. You're no longer negotiating your place. In conversations, in relationships, in life, you simply stand in it. And that presence, it's hard to explain, but easy to feel. And once you experience it, you realize this was never about saying more. It was always about becoming enough without needing to. There is a quiet kind of strength that begins to emerge, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply steady. On Stoicism Breath, this is where everything comes together. Not because you've mastered the world, but because you've finally stopped trying to control how the world sees you. You're no longer trying to correct every misunderstanding. You're no longer jumping in to clarify every detail, to fix every perception. Instead, you allow something different. You allow people to interpret you in their own way. And at first, that might feel uncomfortable. But then something unexpected happens. You create space. Space for people to meet you, without all the layers of explanation that used to surround your words. And in that space, something becomes clear. When you stop trying to convince, your words begin to carry a different kind of weight. Not because they are louder, but because they are truer. They are no longer shaped by the need to be accepted. They are shaped by intention, by honesty, by alignment. And even if people can't fully explain it, they feel it. Because people don't just respond to what you say. They respond to how you say it. They notice the absence of hesitation, the absence of over-explaining, the absence of that subtle, quiet need for approval. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop trying to be understood is often the moment people begin to understand you more clearly. Not because you've explained yourself better, but because there's less noise, less interference, less adjustment. Your communication becomes simpler. And because it's simpler, it becomes clearer. Now, this doesn't mean life suddenly becomes perfect. There will still be tension. There will still be disagreement. There will still be moments where you are misunderstood. But those moments, they no longer define you. They no longer pull you into that exhausting cycle of explaining, adjusting, fixing. You notice them. You acknowledge them. And then, you move forward. And in that movement, something powerful becomes undeniable. You were never meant to negotiate your sense of self. Your choices were never meant to be constantly justified. Your presence does not need to be explained to be valid. And the moment you stop trying to prove those things, they become obvious. Not as ideas, but as reality. Over time, this way of being becomes natural. You don't think about it anymore. It's not a strategy. It's not a technique. It's just how you move through the world. Grounded, present, steady. Not because everything is always clear, but because you trust yourself enough to act, even when it isn't. And that trust changes everything. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you experience life. Because when you stop explaining yourself at every turn, you free up a part of your mind that was always occupied. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Clarity, focus, a deeper connection to who you are and what you truly value. And in the end, the shift is simple. But it is not easy. You stop explaining yourself. Not because you're trying to prove something, but because there is nothing left to prove. And in that quiet realization, you discover a kind of freedom that was always there, hidden beneath the constant need to be understood. At some point, it all becomes clear. This was never about explaining yourself better. It was about trusting yourself enough to stop. And when that happens, everything changes. Not because the world becomes clearer, but because you do. And if this message resonated with you, stay with this path. There is always a deeper level of clarity waiting. This is Stoicism Breath.